Welcome everybody to this webinar here, and on the subject of speaking truth to power. Now, some of you know Hult, Ashridge, some of you don't know them at all, maybe. So it's actually we're part of the world's largest private education company, EF Education First. And so there's this enormous range of learning experiences that we offer. EF really focusing in on language and culture, and Hult Ashridge, where I'm situated, focusing in on business and management and leadership issues. It's a triple accredited business school. It's actually been around for 60+ years. I haven't been around here for quite that long, but it is quite a few years I've been a professor here, and I'm Professor of Leadership and Dialogue. And I'm located in the stunning Ashridge, which is sort of north of London in the UK, and it's absolutely beautiful, I must say, here today. The purpose of today, in just 45 minutes, I'm going to ask you to reflect on speaking up and listening up and why it matters. I'm going to ask you to explore your own conversational habits, and I'll explain what I mean by that in just a little while. Ask you what traps you might fall into in terms of listening up in particular, and I'll show you what a core aspect listening up is to speaking up. And we'll have some time for question and answers. So throughout, if you can just go to the Q&A button rather than the chat button, and drop me any questions in there. I'll try and answer a few of them towards the end of the webinar. I teach as part of Hult online skills and webinars. So this is one subject that I teach on. I also teach on mindfulness and leadership. And if you're interested in any of those other topics as well, just also drop a note in the Q&A or the chat button, and the advisors who are helping me facilitate today will definitely get back to you. So any questions as we go along, just drop them in the Q&A box. It's lovely to have you all here. So let me go into this first question. So I have a question immediately, straight away for you. I would like you to consider something that you feel you could or should speak up about at work, but you haven't yet. So it's something that you haven't said yet. And if you're having trouble with the kind of work context, think about home and family and friends, because there's bound to be something that you haven't said there. So it doesn't have to be a big thing. It might be that you've got some feedback for somebody that you haven't quite said yet, or you disagree with something, or maybe you have an idea about how something could work better. So it might just be a little small thing. So have you got that? One example of something that you haven't yet spoken up about. Now, with that example, I'd like you to just ask yourself, so why? Why have you not yet spoken up about this? And indeed, why might you never speak up about this particular thing? So think through the reasons just for a second. Why is it that I stay silent? So I'm just going to get a feel from you on the answers of that question. So you're just about to see a poll pop up magically on your screen. Look at that. And it asks you, I've just selected a couple of things that may or may not be applicable here. So what leads you to stay silent on this particular subject? Tick whichever ones and however many you think might be applicable here. Is it something to do with lack of confidence, maybe? Maybe you're a bit worried about how you might be perceived, or that you might upset the other person. Perhaps you just think, nah, no point. Nothing's going to happen anyway, or it'll be ignored. Or maybe it's like you've got something to say, but you simply just haven't had an opportunity or the forum in which to speak up. So if none of them are applicable, don't worry about it, don't tick any. But otherwise, if some of those do resonate, just tick the boxes now and then just submit those. And then I'm going to ask the facilitator to magically show us some of the responses on screen. Just there we go, that's coming in immediately. Okay, so we can see here that the fear of being perceived negatively, that's usually quite a popular one. In fact, in the research that we've done with the survey that we've done, that along with the fear of upsetting the other person are the two most common reasons why we choose to stay silent. You can see here that there's a pretty big one there about thinking that you'll be ignored. I'm going to come on to that in just a second, because that is really, really important in organizational context. There are many of us that don't think that there's any point in speaking up, and I'll say something about that in just a while. So we can see some of the reasons there. Thank you so much for showing us that poll. So we'll get rid of that, and we will carry on here, because these sorts of questions are the questions that I've been asking for about 5 years with my co-conspirator, co-author, John Higgins. And we've been asking people, well, why? Why do you stay silent sometimes, and why do you sometimes speak up? And what we're examining really are conversational habits. And here's the thing, as an individual, in our teams, and even in our organizations, we get stuck into patterns around what gets said and what doesn't, and what gets heard and who gets heard and what doesn't. So patterns, stuck patterns in terms of what gets said and what doesn't. And do you know what? These patterns and habits that we have as individuals and collectively, well, they have huge consequences. So sometimes, I'll give you some examples here, sometimes the consequences of habits are that you create innovative cultures, places where it feels really safe and okay to stick up your hand and say, I've got an idea, or I'd like to challenge how we're doing things. And as a result, the consequences are you innovate. Stuck conversational habits can also lead to some slightly more negative consequences. And you can see, I mean, I could have chosen numerous logos to put up here, but many organizations over the past few years have been on the front page of the newspaper for all the wrong reasons, because somewhere or another it wasn't felt to be okay to speak up about something, or people did speak up and they weren't heard in the right way. So huge consequences there. And look, very recently, stuck conversational habits cost lives. And we've seen that with Boeing recently, but right now, here and now, whether you're in China, whether you're in the US, whether you're in the UK, examples of employees in healthcare that have felt unable to speak up freely. And that costs lives. So conversational habits are so important, and they're really, really important to be able to disrupt. Now, let's bring this right into this current crisis that we're facing. Yeah, at the beginning, there was talk of like, oh, when are we going to go back to normal? And I think most people are now understanding that there probably isn't going to be a normal to go back to. So some people are trying to talk about a new normal. And I like to really challenge that, because we are living in unsustainable ways. There are unsustainable levels of social inequality. And the way we are working with our environment is unsustainable. So there is no going back to normal. We will face further crises because of the way that we're living. We will continue to live in a world which feels volatile and uncertain. So whilst there's no normal to go back to, what we could really easily do is sleepwalk back into fairly disastrous conversational habits that mean that we're not able to deal well with our circumstances. And over the last few weeks, I've been talking to many leaders about, well, what sort of conversational habits are working and useful at the moment. And there's three that I've identified in the conversations that I've had that keep coming up, and see whether you agree with these. The first is that, unsurprising is the word agile. So in nearly every single conversation I've had, people have said to me, well, we need to be able to have conversations that enable us to be agile. And that means, and every single one of these are really easy to say and very difficult to do well. We need to invite different perspectives. We need to be able to move decisively, to come to decisions in our conversations, but thoughtfully. And we need to be able to learn through mistakes and successes. And that seems to be at the heart of our conversational habits around agility. Compassion. Thank goodness compassion has started to enter into our organizational dialogue, finally. And maybe it's taken some of this crisis to enable us to notice how we really need to hear other people's experiences. And we need to act with those experiences in mind. And I think it's been fairly clear with some of the leaders that I've been in contact with and observed which of those leaders are able to be compassionate and who hasn't. And there are going to be consequences, I think, of their behavior as a result of that. And the final thing is being guided by purpose and values, no matter what. I might say a bit more about this in a little while. But purpose and values mean we're able to discuss the big picture, the why are we here? Really, why are we here? Is it seriously shareholder value? Or is there any other reason why we might be working here as individuals and teams in organizations? And we've got to be able to challenge what I call the justification discourse. You know, those conversations that start, which justify why it's actually okay not to stick to our purpose and values on this particular thing. That's the justification discourse. We've got to be able to spot that and start to challenge it. And then, of course, ensure ethical decisions and practice via our conversations. So really, if we're to be able to have habits where we're agile, we're compassionate, and we're driven and guided by purpose, we need the capacity to say what needs to be said and hear what needs to be heard. We need the capacity for people to speak up and be listened to. Now, speak up has become really, really popular over the last year or so, driven as well by a lot of interest in psychological safety. And a Harvard professor who I was speaking to yesterday, Amy Edmondson, has been a pioneer in that particular area. So I've worked with a number of organizations who have speak up as a kind of cultural pillar or value now. And as I've observed what various organizations, cross sectors are doing here, I think there's kind of one trap that we seem to fall into quite easily. And that's, we try to fix the individual rather than the system. So let me just explain this with a real example that's been happening. This is what's happened a number of times over the last few months. I get a knock at the door from usually a leader or a leadership team, and they are busy saying they over there aren't speaking up enough. We need our employees to be braver. We need them to be assertive. We need them to be creative and offer up their ideas. We need them to be ethical and speak up about problems and issues, but they're not. Megan, go and sort them out. Off you go. And in this is honestly the stories that I've heard in two different organizations fairly recently. You ask the employees what's going on and they go, last time somebody spoke up, they disappeared. And then you wonder why no one's speaking up. So here's the key point here. A lot of our efforts are on individuals and having courage and bravery to speak up. And my goodness, that's important. Yeah, that's a really critical aspect of what we have to do in organizations. But you know what, if that's all you're focusing on, to be really provocative, it's a complete waste of money and resources, unless you are working on the system's capacity to listen up and have the wisdom to do that. Speaking up does not happen unless there's listening up. So the listening up is particularly important with those people that are perceived to be powerful. So what affects listening up and speaking up? Well, loads of things. But in a nutshell, how we socially construct power. So how we come to understand, again, individually, but collectively in our teams, in our particular organizational culture, in our countries and our national perspectives and understandings around power, status, and authority, and our relative power, status, and authority in relation to others, and what that means around speaking up and listening up. Now, a crisis, this crisis, I think really reveals an organization's and indeed a society's power culture. You know, I think it has become quite clear, particularly again with some organizations and political systems that have talked a good game about dispersed leadership and empowering people and having good conversations. And actually that's shifted very, very quickly in the face of this crisis. And one thing I want to particularly focus on is we seem to persist in disappearing power differences. We find it really quite awkward to talk about power very often. And again, you've seen this in the rhetoric quite recently, you know, the comments that we're, again, political leaders and organizational leaders, we're all in this together. Gosh, this virus is a leveler. These kind of comments, we're seeing that no, this virus isn't a leveler. There are some that are affected deeply more than others. And we're not really all in it together. Some of us face a hugely different risk profile than others in a country, let alone globally. So what is it that's going on with power, and how can we start to talk about it a little bit better? Well, this is a pretty quick and swift charge through some of my research and this area in particular, but part of what we've been doing is trying to unpick what goes on when we choose whether to speak up or stay silent, particularly so that we can start to get into power and status and try to understand how we can disrupt our stories around that to enable people to speak up more freely if that's what's needed. So we've come up with a framework which is called the Truth Framework, and this is, you know, the book is based a lot around this framework, and I don't really have time to go through it too much, aside from saying, so if you're speaking up, you're not really going to speak up unless you trust in your own opinion. And we saw in that poll earlier on today that actually many of us feel a little bit like an imposter, and we don't really have the confidence to speak up or feel that we have the evidence very often. Also, that risk, if we think that the risks and the consequences of speaking up are too great, we will stay silent. And we can catastrophize those, but very often we listen to, well, what happened last time somebody spoke up? What happened last time I spoke up? What were the risks that I faced, the consequences I faced? And again, in organizations, if people face poor consequences as a result of speaking up, well, don't expect them to. You know, that's what their risk profile is focused on. Understanding is around politics. Do I understand people's political agendas? Do I understand what I'm about to say and who that's going to affect and what's on their agenda, so that I might be able to say it in a way that it could be heard? Titles and labels. So you've looked at me on this very little screen on your computer or your phone, but still you've looked at me and you've labeled me. So you labeled me really quickly as, you know, female, British, white, professor, something to do with age and appearance, and you're still labeling me on that. So we label one another, and each of these labels conveys different levels of status and authority depending on our context. So for example, the label of HR, if that's one that you wear, that label means vastly different things in different organizations and different settings, and kind of gives different rules of the game around whether it's okay to speak up or not, or whether you're expected to speak up, or whether you're listened to. And then how to really is the nuts and bolts of when, where, why, what do you say so that what you say lands with the other person. And this truth framework, actually, we work with individuals and teams to go through this in depth so that they begin to be much more aware of how they make these choices, and where in this can we start to disrupt things so that conversational habits change. And we also use this framework for listening up. You're not going to listen to anybody unless you trust in the value of their opinion and you're willing to have your opinion changed. You're not going to invite people to speak up unless you can empathize with the risk that they faced when they do that. Understanding politics, why do you get to hear the things that you get to hear, and what don't you get to hear because of who you are? Again, the titles and labels. How do my titles and labels affect the things that I get to hear? And how do I invite people in a way that they can speak? And the skill that goes around that. So this is one way that we just try and pick apart and raise people's awareness of what goes on in conversational habits. And here's a good question. This is a question that we have posed in our survey. And to date, we've surveyed about 5,500 people globally across sector. And we asked them, this is a lovely question, by the way, I highly recommend it. What happens when you speak up around here? If you don't know how your team would answer that question, you best find out. This is what the response has been from junior respondents. If you speak up with a problem, 1/5 of them think that they might be rewarded or they'll get a positive response as a result of speaking up. Nearly 1/2 of them expect to be ignored. If they speak up with an idea, I thought to myself, well, this will be much more positive. It's a bit more positive, but not much. So there's slightly more people expecting a positive result and a little fewer people, just slightly fewer people expecting to be ignored. And then you ask senior employees, and this is what they respond. I mean, to be fair, they're still fairly dire stats, but they're a bit more optimistic, yeah? Slightly more likely to be rewarded, quite a lot less likely to be ignored in their perceptions. And then look at that, thinking, speaking up with an idea, we jump up to 43% think it will be positive, 24% expecting to be ignored. So a couple of things to take away from this slide. One is the equation's dire. So if you've got people wondering about whether to speak up and they think it is this likely that they'll be ignored and this likely that they'll have a positive response, it's hardly surprising that people are staying silent. It's a real issue that our junior people have such negative perspectives on this, because we call our junior employees the secret keepers. They're very close to the customer. They're close to the product. They see things, they hear things that we need to know about, and yet they're the least likely to speak up about it. But what I want to really, really land with you here is the optimism of senior leaders. And it's not just optimism around what they face when they speak up. It's actually, really interestingly, the more senior you are, the more optimistic you are that other people are speaking up to you when they're not. So let me just repeat that. The more senior you are, the more likely it is that you will think people are speaking up to you, but they're not, all right? So there's three really good reasons why this is the case. Firstly is something that we call superiority illusion, and this affects all of us, doesn't matter where we are in the hierarchy. Superiority illusion means that we broadly think that we're pretty good at speaking up. We think we're amazing at listening. We're certainly better than most of our colleagues. That's what superiority illusion is like. It's a bit like if you ask a group of people, how good are they at driving? And most people think they're better than average. And that equation doesn't match either. So most of us basically are waiting for our colleagues to get better at this rather than looking at ourselves. And that's certainly the case with senior employees as well. Senior employees also face something that we call advantage blindness. And that means that very often when you're in powerful positions in an organization, you have a number of titles and labels that convey status. And it's not necessarily just the hierarchical job title label. So for example, I'm working with a very British institution and their leadership team at the moment, and their chief executive and indeed nearly the entire leadership team are all British, male, white, in their 50s, and a good number of them have been to Oxford or Cambridge. And those titles and labels convey advantage, and they always have done in many settings, not all settings, but many settings. And when you're in that position of advantage and privilege, it's extremely difficult to imagine what it's like when you don't have those labels. You have to work really hard at it. So advantage blindness is something that's really, really common. And the final thing is, the final reason why people, senior people in particular, think things are better than they are, is because nobody's telling them, because they're intimidating. Yeah. I've just written a HBR article, Harvard Business Review article called "Managers, You're More Intimidating Than You Think." So of course, if you're a senior leader and you reach out to your team and go, so, what am I like at listening up, guys? They're probably going to go, great, yeah. Great, good job. I'm exaggerating here, of course. I'm sure many of you would ask for feedback in a much more skilled way than that, but it's very hard for people to give really good feedback upwards. And for that reason, many of our senior leaders are in a bubble. Now, partly because they're in a bubble, they face these traps. And actually, when I run through these traps, I'm then going to ask you, which of these traps, if you fell into one of these traps, which one would it be? So here's the first one, and I've spoken about this a bit. We forget how scary we are. All of us, not just them up there. Doesn't matter, doesn't really matter where you are in the hierarchy. It's likely that there are some people somewhere that find you intimidating. And not because you are necessarily, but because of some of the titles and labels that you wear, because you're confident in their eyes, because you're well networked, because you're from headquarters and they're not, or you speak English as your first language and they don't. Whatever reason, it's likely that some people might find you intimidating, and we do forget about that. We need this capacity to empathize with others and see ourselves how other people see us. Otherwise, we won't do the work that we need to in order to really invite them to speak, because we don't think it's necessary. Second trap, we interviewed a chief executive very early on in our research, and he spoke passionately about the importance of his team speaking up and how everybody's opinion counts. And then he paused and he looked thoughtful and he said, but of course I do have my little list of the people that fit and the people that don't. And of course he was thinking about his little list in his head when he considered whose opinion to listen to. And look, you and I, we all have a little list We all have kind of those people who we tend to listen to more. We have those people that we tend to ask for opinions from. That's absolutely normal and natural. We have to be able to discern. But here's the question for you. Why are these people on your list? And why aren't those people on your list? And do the people that you seek out in terms of opinions, do they look a lot like you? Do you have voices of difference in there? And this is where our titles and our labels, gender, race, job title, age, unconscious bias often leads us towards some people and away from others. Very difficult to kind of face that, but it is what is going on. And we need to question the list if we're going to listen up well. Final one is we send signals all the time. You know, particularly if you're in a powerful position, you're in the spotlight. People are looking at you. I think this is especially the case on Zoom now. For many of you sat for hours on end watching people's in little boxes on your screen. You know, you really study people's expressions. And if somebody powerful is doing that on Zoom or in a meeting when you're speaking, it's quite off-putting. You tend to assume that they think that, you know, you're talking rubbish. Whereas in fact, many people that are like this, you find out it's their thinking face. So do you have a thinking face? I have to say that since I'm doing many more Zoom meetings, and you know you can see yourself, most off-putting, but I have noticed that I have a thinking face, which other people may not know is a thinking face. And of course that shuts people down. So in Nancy Klein's words, who's a colleague of ours, know your face. Do you know what your face is conveying? Is it inviting people to speak or is it closing people down? So here's a question for you. Which of these traps, if you had to choose one which you think you could work on that might make you a better listener, which would it be? I'm going to ask our facilitators to put up a quick question. A poll will appear magically in front of you. Just choose one. Which trap do you think, oh, if I worked on that one, that probably I would be a little bit better at listening up and inviting people to speak? Okay, have you all voted? If we close that, and then when we're ready, if we can just see the results of that. There you go. Okay, it's quite close. All three resonating by the looks of it, but in the lead by a short amount is sending shut up, not speak up signals. Thank you so much. Thank you for showing us that poll there. So maybe going away, there might be an individual action here to notice, you know, with the help of Zoom showing you your reflection, what signals are you sending? So look, what I've been talking about is the importance of conversational habits. I've been talking about how we disappear power. And especially when we're in powerful roles, we kind of forget a lot about power and the impact that it has on other people speaking up. Now, what do we do with this? Well, we do a lot of work with the truth framework and helping leaders to understand some of the traps that they fall into. This is another thing that we're trying to do, and it links to other research that we've been leading here at Holt Ashridge over the last 5 years into mindfulness. So we cannot change habits, whatever habits they are. We can't change them unless we have the awareness in the moment that we're doing what we've always done. Yeah. So if you're going to stop a habit, you have to be able to go, oh, look, I'm doing that again. And if you have that awareness in the present moment and the kind of, rather than judging yourself, the kind of curiosity and openness that goes with that, if you have that in the moment, you know what? It does an amazing thing. it gives you choice. It opens up a space in which you can respond rather than react in autopilot. And that can be practiced, and that can be trained. And so that's another interesting way that we're working with individuals, teams, to spot themselves in the moment of autopilot and choose to do something different. I'm going to bring in my inspiration, David Whyte, the poet here. The first step in deepening the conversation is to stop having the one you're having now. In order to do that, we need the awareness. So coming towards the end here, individually we face these choice points. Yeah, am I gonna shift or change any of my habits? But we face these in our organizations, and we face these in society as well. If, you know, there's a lot of talk. I took part in a big webinar, 24-hour webinar yesterday called Reimagining the Future. So there's lots of people wondering about, well, how do we do things differently? So here's the thing. Well, firstly, we have to. And if we cannot, we cannot and we will not reimagine the future, whether that's for us or for the society that we live in, unless we are aware of the choices and the impact of those choices that we're making. And unless we face into them and help others to also. So we have to have the capacity to be able to speak up and listen up in different ways. I'm going to leave you with I do apologize leaving you with such a horrible picture. There's a reason for it. So this is some nails going down a chalkboard, which I know is one of the most horrible images and sounds that you can possibly imagine. Here's why. Our current conversations, your current conversations, are our future. So they contain within them the seeds of our future already. To reimagine means to change our conversations. And we need to face what I call inconvenient choices. Yeah. If we're doing this well, we are speaking up about some choices that we have to make that will be hard and uncomfortable. They'll be a bit like facing into those choices. But we have to do it, and we have to do it now as a society, but also in many of our organizations, teams, and also as individuals. So just in summary, conversational habits have consequences. We need different habits that are agile, compassionate, and purpose-led. But we try very often and fix the individuals rather than the systems. Powerful people are often in a bubble and disappear power. Truth framework is one way that we can start to explore that a little bit more and work with what we call the mindful application of power so that people can speak up. And our current conversations hold the seeds for our future. They are our future. So if we're not shifting our habits now, our future won't change. We can't reimagine it. With that, I'm going to open up just for the last 5 minutes. There's a slide with further resources on there and my contact details, and I would love to hear from you. But I will also take a quick look now into the Q&A box, and I will just scan my eyes down here. So I've got a question, Manu. Nice to hear from you. I will just go on to the next slide as well. There we go. So Manu says, what is the role of lack of cross-cultural empathy to our conversational habits? And I've mentioned cross-cultural differences in passing, but this is one of the most important features of conversational habits. And obviously the different cultures, different national kind of cultures affect how we perceive power and the kind of rules of the game around who gets to say stuff and who gets heard. And so particularly in cross-cultural teams, if we're going to shift habits of conversation, we probably have to talk about differences in cross-cultural understanding. And we have to do that in a way that is curious and also compassionate, and understanding really that there's not a right here, there's difference. So how do we work with that so that we understand one another more? We're actually doing some more research right now on the survey and trying to understand the impact of cross-cultural communications. So thank you. It's a really important question. Thank you for bringing that up. I have, gosh, there are loads here. Do companies, an anonymous one, do companies with more diversity tend to have better systems for listening and speaking up as their culture is built to mitigate common traps? This is a bit, this sort of raises the question of diversity and inclusion. You can have diversity, but you might not have inclusion. The potential is there with teams and organizations that are diverse. You have those differences in perspective, but then of course you've got to be able to work with that diversity. So I've been with organizations that have levels of diversity, but they're not being able to access them, and the same people are being listened to. So I think both of those elements of the equation are just really, really important. Thank you for that question. As a director, who's this? Amar. As a director, how do I encourage junior employees to speak up without upsetting the managers they directly report to? You know what, that's a really common question actually. And this, and again, quite culturally specific, because within some organizations and countries, it's kind of okay to skip levels and have conversations, and it's not really thought of particularly badly. And then in other cultures, that's just not how it's done. And so there's this framing of cultural reference that needs to go on top of that. And my advice is that as far as possible, it is a conversation with middle managers so that they understand why you are doing what you're doing. And it basically will depend on the levels of trust that they have with you. You know, how are you using the information that you're accessing? If you're using the information that you're accessing to then hit the middle managers with what you're hearing, don't be surprised that they want to try and block access to the junior employees. And this brings up another, point I really want to make actually, is your response as a senior person when you hear information is really, really critical. Because if you respond poorly and cut somebody down or ignore, then people won't speak up again. And similarly, if you hear information and then there are consequences, it may well silence others. So we have to do that bit very, very carefully. I think I may have time for one more question. There's some quite funny comments on here. What can a person do? Oh, Siddhar, thank you very much for this one. What can a person do if they trust their words but feel like they'll just embarrass themselves by speaking up? This is the area of imposter experience. So it's that little voice that kind of comes in and says, no, don't do it. You'll embarrass yourself. You'll look silly. They'll know that you don't know what you're talking about. Now, first thing is to know that that imposter voice is really important, and nearly all of us have it. I have interviewed a few people that need more imposter voice. Okay, so I have definitely interviewed a few particularly senior people who could do with more doubt in their own opinion, but most of us actually, we need to be able to dial down that voice of doubt and that lack of confidence. You know, remember that voice is there to help and protect you very often. And again, this is where mindfulness comes in. We have to have the capacity to listen to the voice and go, oh, hello, it's you again. I know you're trying to keep me safe, but how can I do small experiments which feel okay to do so that I can gradually start to build my confidence? And who can support me in the process when I'm doing that? So I'm really pleased you brought that question up, because it's a very common concern as well. Now with that, I think I probably need to close. I need to thank you so much for joining me from literally all over the world. I really hope you've enjoyed this. It has been a pretty rapid travel through my research, but if you have any other questions or you want to contact me, please do, or also drop a note to the advisors that are helping, thank you, run this webinar. Best wishes to you, and thank you again for joining me. Take care.